Amanda McCracken is a sexual empowerment and intimacy advocate on a mission to help society evaluate the intersection of emotional vulnerability, mental health, and sexual ethics. A freelance journalist, she is driven to explore what her 41 years of virginity taught her about longing. She is currently writing her book, When Longing Becomes Your Lover, which is a personal, cultural, and scientific investigation of a young woman with an unhealthy addiction to longing for unavailable men. While her bylines have appeared in magazines such as Vogue, the New York Times, Elle, Self, and many others. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome sexual empowerment and intimacy advocate Amanda McCracken. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, when I first read the story, the first thing that popped into my mind was a 41-year-old female virgin sounds like the sequel to Steve Carell's 40-year-old virgin movie. And did your pre-virgin days resemble that film?
Definitely not. Unfortunately, I feel like that film is one reason I've been writing a lot about this because I feel like it has kind of portrayed late in life virgins as just being weird and uncomfortable with their body and afraid to date. And that definitely wasn't me. So, unlike Steve Carell, or his character, I can't remember what that guy's name was in there, but I did date. I dated like over 100 guys. I mean, I was, that maybe averages only 3 or 4 a year. So, after you've been single for 41 years, almost, I had a couple long-term relationships in there, but so definitely not the Steve Carell character.
Well, your story is very, very interesting. And even with, let's look at a little bit of the scientific investigation. Did you compare men versus women when it comes to late in life virginity?
Um, not, I mean, and some of the research I did, I came across, some statistics on it, but nothing that I can recall offhand that was significant. Not that like there were more females or men that were waiting. So,
Well, why didn't you give up hope, that you would find a mutually loving relationship and just have sex with someone you felt a physical connection with? Because that seems to be the common denominator nowadays.
yeah, I just had, I mean, I'm pretty goal oriented and as an athlete, like, and as an endurance athlete, I mean, maybe you can relate as being a cyclist. I think you're a cyclist that
Yeah.
you kind of get, that was my goal was to wait until I was in a mutually loving and committed relationship to have sex. And I really just believed in my gut that he was out there and that um, it was worth waiting for. So
Well, were you a teenage female athlete?
I was, yeah. I mean, was on a swim team when I was in elementary school, on all the way on up through high school, and a long distance runner. Still am.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because for a lot of people who do not know, especially with female athletes from teenagers to those going into college, those that are really into athletics and are, let's say, training on a daily basis and competing, I understand that their hormone levels can be different. The menstrual cycles can be delayed for some.
Mm.
And on the
Hmm.
scientific side of things, did that pull away from any type of sexual desire in any cases?
Well, that's a great question, but in my case, no. I mean, the endurance sports didn't delay my period. And it's certainly, I think I was a little bit of a late in life bloomer in terms of like sex drive, but in my mid 20s, I would say, and definitely, it definitely ramped up in my 30s. So, um, but I don't feel like that, you know, I was like dampening my, my sex drive with the sports. So,
Well,
I don't
how
think
did
that really played
you
a role.
well, how were you able to, let's say, control the sex drive if you were dating someone and you were actually wanting to wait?
You mean like how did I keep myself from having sex with somebody that I was very, very
Yeah.
attracted to?
Yeah.
It was hard, but I mean, we have brains, we have self control, we have the ability to make choices, and so I think that that played a role instead of just like letting animal instincts, I suppose, take over. Um, so I do think though that the endurance sports did have an impact on my discipline and sense of being goal oriented and some self control, if that makes sense, pacing
Yeah.
myself, so to speak. So
Well, how did all the men that you dated, were some of them understanding or were some of them frustrated?
a little bit of both. I would say for the most part, I think it surprises a lot of people that men didn't pressure me. Um, um, there were a surprising number that really didn't really want to talk about it either. So I did bring up, um, you know, if I was going on a date and sometimes I would bring it up on a date. Sometimes I would bring it up a couple dates later if things were getting kind of hot and heavy, just to kind of put up a stop sign, so to speak, of like a, you know, yield ahead, so to think, so to speak. But you know, I think if it might have deterred some guys, but some of them were okay with just kind of hanging in there to see where things went. And there were uh it's complicated, but there was one guy in my 20s that I was in a long-term relationship with who I did tell him I will have I want to have sex with you, and it took a lot of guts, a lot of my took me a long time to get to that point. And he was in the military and he was getting ready to be deployed, and he said no. And I think probably because he didn't know what our future looked like. But I give him a lot of credit for, in the heat of the moment, to be like, no, I don't think this is probably the best decision to make right now. And it did take. I think I kind of reeled in my heart at that point. It took me a while to get back into a long term relationship. So
Well, I think it showed on his side, he showed a great level of respect for you.
yeah, absolutely.
And I think that actually lacks in today's society. And I really applaud you, Amanda, because I think women today, and I hopefully this isn't taken incorrectly, but especially with the media and the way sex is portrayed on television and in film and in social media, I think
Hmm.
women need to be the one that says no. And for some women, really, I think when they say no, there's a higher level of value for them, and not just to fall in to whatever the guy may be wanting or pressuring or thinking that sex for any reason is normal. But I think for a lot of women, I think it raises their level of value by saying no.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's necessarily should fall on the woman, but I definitely feel like there needs to be more of a conversation around it instead of like just like we were talking about earlier in the heat
Yeah.
of the moment, just like going for it. I suppose there's plenty of cases where that's great and it works out for both individuals, but I feel like um, getting into a relationship with somebody where you can be intimate and talk about your needs and fears is really important. And for I can speak for myself from a female standpoint. I think it's important to um, value yourself and your choice, and not just assume that you owe some guy because he took you out for a lobster dinner. sex.
Yeah, exactly. And I completely agree. I mean, there's no way I would ever want to be in the dating scene today. To me, that just seems terrifying. But how has sex positive feminism forced women into engaging in emotionally disconnected intimacy?
Yeah, I think that the sex revolution or feminist revolution, in the 60s and 70s did women a favor by making them, allowing them to feel free to do what they want with their bodies, but and to have sex and with whom and when they want and so forth. But I feel like there's been in the past couple decades, there's been more of a push for like uh, any anything is better than nothing, and kind of the more the better. Um, so it's almost like I feel like women in today's society can't win. You're either like a prude or you're a slut. So to uh, yeah, so I feel like there's more of a push now for it's trendy to have um, multiple partners of different genders, and kink,
Mm.
is trendy, and so there's been a lot of talk about how that actually has been corrosive to intimacy in relationships. Like to strip the intimacy from the relationship has made it perhaps easier to engage in these activities, but eventually I think it catches up to individuals who almost kind of become conditioned not to be vulnerable and talk about their needs.
Well, would you agree that, and let's just use teenage girls and college age girls as an example, they don't have the level of maturity in many cases to make very important decisions. Having sex is an important decision. And if the situation is negative or there's something wrong there, just one sexual encounter can mentally harm their mental health for the rest of their life. So for you, I mean, do you regret waiting, and do you encourage, let's say, teenage girls, college age girls to maybe just step back and wait and really think about the decision they want to make in the areas of sexual intimacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a daughter, and so I thought about this even before I ever met Dave, my husband, and ever before I knew if I could ever even conceive. Like, what would I tell my daughter in this situation, and what will I tell her? And specifically for me, I don't regret waiting. Um, it was more of my patterns of um, chasing unavailable men, men who couldn't or didn't love me, were emotionally unavailable or living in another country. It was almost more appealing to chase after these um, men that I saw as potentials than actually seeking out men who were there and they were like, "Oh, I really like you," and had like good attachment styles, um, and come from good families. I say good families. I know that sounds that could be taken different ways, but had good relationships with their parents. I think that's important, and I think that says something that they still care for their family and they're not estranged. Um, so that maybe that answers your question about like, did I regret waiting? So no, but I do regret not paying attention to my patterns a little bit sooner. Maybe not. I wish I'd probably gotten into therapy a little bit sooner. But then I wouldn't have had some of the adventures I had, I suppose. So, perhaps there's the argument for, you know, destiny or fate, and I wouldn't have ended up with the man that I'm with now, who I think I should be with, if I hadn't made some of the mistakes I made. And I'll
Well,
tell my daughter that. So, but
what
with regards to your
actually?
question about like teenagers now,
Yes.
I think the important message is to really instill a sense of self-worth, and that they value their bodies, and they value their choices, and that starts at, like, I think, with parenting. So at least right now, I can start instilling that sense of self-worth in my daughter, even at a young age, before, 15, 10 years down the road, or 12 years down the road, when I start talking about sexual choices with her.
Yeah, and I think with teenage girls especially, they need to understand definitely self-worth. That's number one. But also the power to say no. On the other side, with teenage boys, college age boys, if a girl says no, you agree to the no. And if you don't want to see her anymore, break it off and go on to something else. Don't be pushing what you physically want on somebody that keeps saying no, because you're going to cause that other person more harm than good, especially in the long term. For
Mm-hmm.
you, what actually started the longing for unavailable men? Where did that start?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, to be honest, even when I was in, like, high school, I had this obsession with, the TV show Lois and Clark: Adventures of Superman, with Dean Cain, Terry Hatcher, and just this kind of idealizing of, uh, a man that I would pursue, or that was out there. And it was kind of I think it became a safe way, or a way of feeling safe, because then, if you're always idealing somebody that you're not, you're never going to find Superman. But if you're always idealizing that image, then you're not going to get hurt either, because you're never going to find him. You're never going to get in that relationship. So I feel like I started those patterns even back in high school, and I feel like culture just kind of continued to feed that feedback loop.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we, people's mindsets, and it's amazing that, and I love the fact that you look at sexual ethics. You're doing this research, and at the same time, you're looking at mental health, because there's a strong correlation between the two. And I've talked to especially women that have gone through things like sexual abuse, and the lifelong um, struggles that they go through, just because of, if it was one encounter or if it was multiple encounters that were traumatizing. It's hard to break free from that. And so there's a strong mental health aspect to that. So I'm glad that you are tackling those type of areas. But I want to ask you something, because when I was approached to interview you, uh, how do you handle the identity of being a former 41-year-old virgin and now talking about sexual empowerment? Do you embrace
Hmm.
that identity?
Yeah. So I would say that it took me a while to, I actually say, like, break up with virginity, because for so long that was who I was. I wrote about it. I spoke with other women who were kind of trying to navigate that world out there, where, um, being, even a 25-year-old virgin was weird in society. So, like I said earlier, I think it helped. It was important for me to work on breaking those patterns of longing, and um, recognizing that some of those patterns of longing, like, related to mental health, were kind of that addiction to, like, a dopamine addiction, where you're kind of like, uh, you get that dopamine when you're anticipating, and it's almost more fun than getting what you want. And so, kind of realizing the cycle I was in was helpful in breaking up with that identity. But in terms of, like, switching to sexual empowerment, I wouldn't say it was even really like now that I'm having sex, like I'm all about sexual empowerment. I think I was about sexual empowerment even as a virgin because it was like I was saying, um, you have, you know, you have a choice. I mean, with the whole feminist movement, it was all about, it's your choice to do what you want with your body. So I feel like there is empowerment in saying no when you don't feel you're in a safe or a comfortable position to have sex.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I pray for all of you ladies watching and listening that there is great power in saying no. So keep that in mind. So, but I want to ask you something because I just recently, Amanda, interviewed someone that had gone through sexual abuse at a very, very young age, but as they got into their teenage years and pretty much their adult life, they leaned on alcohol and in a way used alcohol to basically break down their own personal barriers so they could engage with anyone or anything at any time. Um, so, what are the dangers of using alcohol to disassociate in order to allow your body to do what everyone else is doing?
Yeah, I think even though I wasn't having sex, I which people assume, associate with being super conservative and so forth, or, like super prude and didn't go out and so forth. I was going out with a lot of people and I was drinking too. And I think I did use alcohol as a way of, um, uh, my goal wasn't to disassociate, but I think I did get to that point in a couple situations where I kind of made it a habit. And then eventually my body was got to the point of being like, no, this is not good anymore. And it eventually it told me in a couple situations where I just in an intimate situation where I was just bawling, and then I got into a couple more situations with a couple more men that I was dating. This was probably in my late 30s after feeling pretty heartbroken about one particular guy, and I warned one guy, and I was like, I might cry, if we start making out. And he's like, oh, he said, that's kind of, he's like, that's sexy. And I'm like, no, it's not actually. But yeah, I feel like alcohol can be a way of escaping listening to your body, especially in the case of, like the person you were talking about with abuse. But a lot of people, I think, use it to escape intimacy, like really engage. Like, yeah, you can throw your clothes off and get with somebody, but you may not really be intimate with them, like in terms of like connecting emotionally. Emotional intimacy is what I'm talking about. So.
Now, was that so? Is that how you looked at or abstaining from sexual activity? Did you look at it as wanting that true emotional, intimate connection?
That's what I was reserving sexual intercourse for. Yes, was to experience that with a man who I knew that I trusted and who was, I loved him, he loved me, and we were committed to each other. I wasn't necessarily waiting for marriage. I was
Yeah.
earlier in my probably in my teens, early 20s, and then I was like, this may not be realistic at this point, especially when I got into my 30s and like, I don't know, but I just want to find that surely that guy's got to be out there, and they were out there, but I just kept, chasing guys who didn't want to commit. So,
Well, did you ever have times where you're just like, I'm tired of being a virgin. Let me just get it over with?
um, yeah, I did. And I think that's when I was, I spoke to, that's when I was working through some things in therapy. So it wasn't just and it's not that easy. Like after you have like waited that long, it's kind of like, I felt like, you can't just like drop out of a race that you've been in. Back to the endurance, analogy. Um, I think there's a piece of perfectionism in here that I'm still working on, actually, in terms of not trying to perfect everything, and that's an ongoing piece for me.
Well, let me ask you this because, you know, let's talk about the medical community for a moment. You have gynecologists, you have primary caregivers. What does the medical community actually need to understand about late in life virgins so they don't make them feel abnormal?
Yeah, I've talked to several women who are still virgins or were, virgins in their late 20s, 30s, and they have all shared similar stories where the whether it was a gynecologist or primary care physician, they usually, in your annual exam, they'll say, when's the last time you had sex, and like me, like the other women I spoke with, would be like, well, we haven't, and they'd start asking her, have you had a penis there, um and uh and then they would let up, or they'd be like, really, when is the last time you had sex,
Oh,
like
so they wouldn't
so
believe you.
exactly. So I think that's the biggest thing, is for people in the medical community to start believing late in life virgins, um and to, yeah, not make them feel like something, just by not believing someone automatically feels makes them feel like they're abnormal.
Well, not only that, I mean, let's say you have a woman that's 35, she goes to the gynecologist, he asks when's the last time you had sex, and she goes, never. And his idea is, you're probably lying and you don't want to tell me because you're probably embarrassed, but she's actually telling the truth. So I don't even think it's feeling abnormal. I think it's more of almost like, hey, this doctor doesn't believe what I'm saying. And so that comes back to me thinking the doctor's not listening.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it makes the person being asked these questions feel like um, they perhaps, their definition of virginity isn't good enough, or their definition of sex, so it gets into a whole slew of other philosophical questions too.
Well, absolutely. Now, how do patterns of longing develop and can impact us negatively?
Kind of like I was talking about earlier with the dopamine cycle. And I'm not a doctor, but as a journalist, I've tried to do a lot of research, spoke to some neuroscientists about this, um, and even like in our culture with our binge watching addiction, Netflix addiction, um, what's the online shopping, online dating, online real estate shopping like Zillow. It perpetuates this cycle of like anticipating or longing for something better than what you have. Um, and I think awareness is the key to at least stepping back and looking at your patterns. Where are you spending your time? Um, where are you hyper focused? And to be comfortable stepping away perhaps from some of those habits that are really drawing you away from the present, especially during the pandemic. Like, who wanted to be quote unquote present when crap's happening everywhere? So there definitely was an uptick in um, more like online dating and online shopping and Zillow, shopping for real estate, the bigger house, a better place than what you have, but without ever any intent of actually buying it, but you're still shopping, quote unquote. So,
Well, let me ask you this. I actually did a search of, and I've seen the list of the top 10 search engines, and five in that top 10 are porn sites. How has are we, I mean, has our society become that over sexualized?
I mean, I would hope not. That is surprising. But man, that sets up a standard for people. So
Yeah,
that's a little scary.
yeah, it tells you that people are searching more than whatever they're looking for on Amazon or Google, and those lists were the same before the pandemic and still the same during and even after the pandemic. And I think for a lot of the scientific research is showing that you know kids as young as 8 years old having
Oh,
free
wow.
access to those sites, and that alone is causing a mental disorder that is very difficult to break. And again, that can lead to both boys and girls never having the power to say no, and really waiting for the right person.
Yeah, and really distort expectations for what sex should be and what, that your partner is going to do or not do. So
Yeah.
that is pretty shocking.
Yeah, and now let me ask you this, Amanda. Why do people need to stop blaming the purity culture and start looking at their own poor habits?
Yeah. So I did grow up in the church, um, still go to church. I went through one of the ring ceremonies, like a true love waits is what it was called. Um, but it was, for me, it was more like an empowerment thing. Like, oh, okay, yeah, I can wait. I'll show you how long I can wait. But I feel like I've looked around at a lot of other women who went through some of those ceremonies and came out of quote unquote a purity culture. Um, and I feel like, yeah, there is something to be said for the purity culture having maybe given women a distorted view of their how would I say, like their choice and what they do and how they feel about their body and having sexual experiences. But I think it's become like a scapegoat, like that that women who came out of that era and came out of the churches that are like, oh, the church screwed me up, um, because now I'm, because of all my promiscuous activity, or because it took me so long to figure out when and who I could have sex with. Um, I think there are a lot of, that's a seed. The church plants a seed, perhaps, that may or may not be helpful, but I think that there are a lot of other seeds that are planted along the way, and you have to unravel all of those things. And that's something I had to do, not just like blame the church eventually when I'm like, why am I still a virgin in my 30s? Is something wrong with me? Is it all because the church screwed me up? And look at culture also, and just look at my own patterns, and reassess those as one big wad of a spider web. I suppose you might look at, like, pull those strands apart.
Well, what were some of the things that you were hearing from other people who were late in life virgins? I mean, what were the things that they were telling themselves? Like, why am I still this way? I mean, what were some of the things that they were blaming?
um well, let's say some of them are still, some of them that I talk to are still very confident in their choice. Like, they're like, no, this is what I'm waiting for, and thank you for putting a voice to the empowerment of waiting for, what you want. But there were some that I think, mm, well, like you brought up earlier, like blamed some bad situations in the past. I don't know if it would necessarily be sexual abuse, but like, perhaps having had some experiences with men, and I'm speaking from a heterosexual,
Right.
point of view here,
Sure.
that made them feel badly about themselves. Um, so
Now, have you had any discussions with some of them based on maybe what their parents uh, think about them not as teenagers or college, but if they're in their, let's say in their 30s and maybe 40 and they're still a virgin, what are their parents saying? Good for you, or will you just go out and have sex? I mean, what are they telling their child?
Yeah, I haven't heard, that's a great question. I should ask some of them more specifically about that. I have said, most of them, I don't think their parents are there. I think one of them said, a woman I spoke to in Ireland was like, well, my dad might thinks that that's the case, but he just doesn't really want to know. So I think maybe at that point, I don't know how many parents really are aware of it. My parents were always like supportive, like, this is your choice, okay. And I would talk to my mom about more than she really wanted to know. Definitely TMI. But once you told her, once you kind of like a um, confessional sort of situation. I'm not Catholic, but it was almost like once you keep telling her, you just keep telling her stuff. So I did get to a point where, and I was talking to her about all these, like, all the things running around in my head. And she did say, Amanda, when you have sex, I don't really want to know. I was like, okay. And that actually was a little liberating in some ways to be like, yeah, this is still not about getting straight A's anymore,
Yeah.
that back to the perfectionism thing.
Yeah,
So,
because kids are not going to talk to their parents if they have it. The parents would rather, you know, let time evolve, and when it happens, it happens, and as long as nobody gets hurt, then they're at peace about that. And and with parents, they just want what's best for their child not to go through any hurt or trauma or be scarred for life. As long as everything is happy, everything's good, and that the parent's life is not disrupted, let's really be honest here,
yeah.
everything's fine. And so I understand that point of view. Now, how close are we going to see this book when longing becomes your lover?
Hopefully in the next, I don't know, year or two. So I'm still waiting for a publisher to gobble me up. So, fingers crossed.
Well, I think it would be, well, I know it will be a fantastic read, Amanda. I think it's a subject that needs to be shouted a little bit louder in this day and age. I, for one, believe in the power of no on multiple levels. I think there is a safety net with the power of no before we say yes to anything. Gives us time to think, time for many of you out there, time to mature before you make a decision that, is very, very important. And I think in this case, when it comes to having sex for the first time, that should be a very important decision. Now, Amanda, where can all of my viewers and listeners know more about you? Is there a particular website that they can go visit?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, my website is www.amandajmccracken.com, or on Instagram at um, at Amanda J. McCracken.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, amandajmccracken.com. If you want to know more about this incredible subject, and ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls from teenage to college, look, you have the power. If you want to wait until you find that right person, there's no harm in waiting. And you're probably going to do yourself a whole lot of good by waiting, saying no, but then saying yes at the right time. So remember that. It's time for all of us to, well, in a way, grow up, mature a little bit before we make major decisions in life. So I hope you enjoyed this interview with Amanda McCracken. And again, go to amandajmccracken.com to learn more about her. And I can't wait for that brand new book. Stick around. I will be right back with more.